I'm Stephanie Unravel. I'm coming to talk to you today about a concept that I have taken from psychodrama and therapy around thinking about how to use personal playing of roles to work through personal issues and adapting that model to thinking about what happens after trauma in terms of our identification or our confusion around roles such as victim, perpetrator, or rescuer. And I'm going to explain what that means. So Stephen Karpman created something called the Drama Triangle. And basically it locates people as assuming a certain role, particularly in relationships where we think about violence being enacted. So there is a perpetrator role, there's a victim role, and there's a rescue role. Now, I've worked on this model in terms of thinking about trauma and in terms of working with people to process their own traumas, to release them from what I had adapted to think about the trauma triangle. But it's all based on Stephen Karpman's work. So I'm going to try to explain it here. I think it's a little bit difficult to metabolize because it's complicated and it has to do with not only how we operate individually, but the way that society takes up these roles and kind of co-opts our thinking and places us into these positions in ways that aren't necessarily authentic for us. And hopefully I'll cover all of that, at least for your thinking. I really support questions around this in the chat if you have questions. Let's return to the concept of this triangle. We have the role of a perpetrator, the role of a victim, and the role of a rescuer. Very often within the traumatic experience, it is in the moment of the traumatic event, especially when the traumatic event relates to anything that is associated with human betrayal, that we take on a role, a perpetrating role, a victim role, or a rescuer role. So what does this look like? In cases where the trauma of human betrayal is enacted upon us or on the individual, then it is immediately that the individual identifies as the victim. Once the victim has identified as such, then there is the role of the perpetrator. So who enacted the act of human betrayal? The rescuer role is slightly more complicated because it's the person that comes in and would essentially save the victim. What that means, and the way to understand the rescuer role as differentiated from somebody who's just helping, is that a rescuer is intent upon, without even realizing it sometimes, eradicating the agency of the victim. So before we talk about the complexity of that, let's go back to review each role. So a victim has the experience of the world or an event that something is being done to them. There is an experience of helplessness, an experience of disempowerment, perhaps danger, threat, and fear come into play. One can think about withdrawing because I have no power. That would lead into feelings of shame or worthlessness. Ultimately, though, when you're thinking about the victim role, that's when I don't have a choice. I am at the mercy of other people, other events, things, and I can't enact my own agency in order to change or improve a situation. The perpetrator role is probably the easiest to understand because it's me doing something to somebody else, right? Or that I'm going to yell at somebody, or I'm going to be violent or forceful to somebody because I don't want to claim such violence. It would be that somebody has stolen my wallet, or somebody has broken into my home, and now I'll start to escalate, so trigger warning. Somebody has enacted a rape on someone else. In terms of war, someone's bombing someone else, then they're assuming the perpetrator role. Returning to the rescuer wants to come in and break up the relationship between the perpetrator and the victim, even if not actual. So maybe we're not talking about actually interfering in the act of trauma or human betrayal, but addressing the victim and taking on some of the hurt that the victim feels after being perpetrated upon. A rescuer will have a desire to stop violence and will intrude in where they think it might be helpful for the perpetrator to disrupt the circulation of violence, so to speak. It's complicated because the rescuer role gets often intertwined with the helper. And it is the truth that people that take on roles of helping professions will have often an experience of wanting to interfere and help somebody that they don't think can help themselves. I want to say, in terms of thinking about the rescuer role, that I want to suspend the conversation around people that are actually helpless. So when we're talking about children or people that don't have access to basic needs, going in and helping them or being a rescuer may be appropriate and helpful. We are talking about adults that have some kind of agency, not people that are actually in positions that are helpless. So the reason why I like using this triangle, and by the way, one size does not fit all, so this is a way or a model of thinking that might be helpful for some people. But the reason why I like to use it is when I'm thinking about trauma and trauma theory, and I'm trying to facilitate someone's personal growth, and they're stuck in any one role, it kind of helps to understand that there's a dynamic, and it's possible at any given time to shift from one role to another role. And that when we can identify when we're doing this, it enables us to break out of this trauma triangle. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, but what I want to underscore is that as long as we're participating in one of these roles, we haven't yet left the traumatic narrative behind. I think one of the things that's really helpful for people that have a trauma history or have a trauma within their families of origin is if they can suspend their emotional involvement when things in a family get heated, for instance, and observe the dynamic that they may be able to approach a situation of high stress without taking on one of these roles, and therefore enabling the situation to progress more quickly. So I want to back up, because one of the things that I think is really important to know about the victim role is that there is a time and place for claiming one has been victimized. And acknowledging and asserting that there was a wrong done and there was a victim experience is absolutely and 100% fine. So nothing I'm saying would dismiss or undermine the experience of being a victim. What I push against is the continued identification with that role, because what it does ultimately is it allows us to disempower ourselves. And if my goal, as is my goal with these videos, is to help people develop agency, then it's very important to break out of the interpretation of oneself as a continual victim. When you have a trauma history, moving between the three roles is frequently the case. So a victim can become the rescuer, can become the perpetrator. I like people to think about their capacity to be in any given role, because if you're in a given role, then you are by nature in this Karpman's Drama Triangle, or the way that I'm putting it, you're in the trauma triangle. To be able to identify when you're doing that is really helpful to breaking out of your own cycle of dysfunction or unhappiness or difficulty in relationship to a trauma. So let's use an example of this. Let's talk about bullying. So somebody who is bullied in school, who feels isolated, who feels victimized, can easily, given the chance, become the bullier to another person, right? So they'll exchange the role of victim for the role of perpetrator in the act of bullying someone else. Not uncommon. Part of that has to do with power. As the victim being bullied, I have a feeling of being disempowered. in order to shift those roles, in order to feel like I have power, I may fall into the trap of hurting someone else and being a bullier to another person. Now, where is the rescuer in all of that? So this is, again, the most difficult one to understand, I think, in terms of it being not the most useful way to respond to a situation. The rescuer is someone who's going to interfere, but interferes in a way that takes power away from the victim. So, for instance, this may be necessary. So not any one of these given roles is definitely a terrible thing. So it's not, I don't want you to walk away from this video thinking, oh, if I take on this role, I'm horrible, or I shouldn't take on this role, because there may be a time where being in one of these roles is useful. But I think it's helpful to understand them so that you can actually make a choice about where you're going to locate yourself and why. So if somebody's being bullied and another person comes in and stops the action, I don't know that I would call that precisely a rescuer. The only way I think that that would be the rescuer role is then if there was a creation of dependence on the rescuer to always take care of the person being bullied. A more appropriate goal would be to step in, stop the violent action, and then help the person who feels as if they're a victim develop strategies, strengths, ways of behavior or avoidance in order to develop agency and self-esteem in terms of resisting any capability of being perpetrated upon. The point at which a rescuer comes in and becomes a dependent function for a victim, that stays within the triangle. I have a couple concerns that motivate me to want to talk about this. One, I think it's fair to say if we have hurt enacted upon us, if we're bullied, if we're victimized, that we all have the potential to turn into someone who hurt someone else. So reflection on that experience and the development of our own worth and agency, our own worth and our own power is important so that we don't hurt other people. Also, so that we don't continue to hurt ourselves. Also, so that we don't just rely on other people to do things that we would be better off doing for ourselves so that we feel strong in the world. The rescuer becomes the person that somebody relies upon to guarantee or to manifest or show that the victim has worth. And what my goal would be is for the victim to have worth because there is a deep belief that the victim is worthy. So I want to have worth because I believe I am worthy, not because I depend on someone else to validate or tell me that I'm worthy. I do think there is a role, for instance, with children and parents, where we communicate worth to somebody. So I'm not saying that this is a necessary thing that we eliminate from our lives, but I think it's worth thinking about. Do we depend on someone else for our worth, or does that come from within? Do we depend on someone for our esteem? Does someone externally have to tell us that? Do we depend on them and want them to come in to tell us how good we are, or can we actually generate that experience in ourselves? The potential for harm is that if we have to have someone else validating us, that can quickly turn into a mess in that triangle and be another form of violence enacted upon us. I want to reiterate, there are times where it's important, crucial, and necessary to say, I am a victim, I was a victim. What I'm seeking to project to you all, or what I'm seeking to develop here in my thoughts, is that having that stance for the long term does us a disservice. And my hope is that people can reflect on their personal relationships, their experiences at work, at school, in their families, and think about how they can break out of roles that lock them into certain behaviors which don't ultimately lead to growth and self-worth. So that brings me to thinking about, okay, how do you get out of this cycle? You know, how does the bullier not continue the behavior? How does the bullied get out of the dynamic of feeling victimized or dangerously stepping into the role of wanting to project their own anger and hate onto other people? I think ultimately, and in all cases, including the rescuer who gets some kind of value over creating dependency with another person, is developing our own inner self-worth. Really, it comes down to believing in our innate worth, our innate strength, our ability to allow our bodies, our minds, our intellect, our thoughts, our physical movement to heal us. Now, the word heal is complicated for me, and I'm going to actually do a video on the concept of healing. But if we think about, if we fall down and bruise our knee or cut our knee, we have this kind of assumption, that's gonna heal. If it's a bad wound, it may leave a scar, but it's gonna repair itself. And I think it's a good metaphor because we can actually trust our insides to repair themselves, given the proper tools, given the proper external environment, given the proper education about our own self-care. Thinking about how we develop our own self-worth is a step. I did a video on self-worth, and so I will offer that part of what distinguishes the victim from being in that trauma triangle is the development of agency. So I believe that I can act, and I act for my own well-being, for instance. Doing that, taking the steps to develop my sense of integrity. So that's like making a commitment to yourself and sticking by it. These are ways that we can move out of feeling as if we're being victimized, even by the world. So it's the idea that I can trust myself, I develop my own sense of self-worth, I take responsibility for my own actions and even the things that happen around me, perhaps, so that I'm always moving out of being in this triangle to the best of my ability.